I have two brief questions I'd like to ask, if I may.
Hi, welcome to Left Foot Media. My name is Brendan Malone and you're watching The Daily Question. Today's question of the day, Making of a Murderer Season 2, who is guilty? Now, the reason I'm asking that question is because I've just finished watching Season 2 of Netflix's Making of a Murderer. You will remember that the original Making of a Murderer, Series 1, was an absolute television phenomenon. It was a thing that just went global. It was sort of viral all around the world. Everyone was talking about this series, and in particular, the true crime and the case of Steven Avery and Brendan Dassey, who was guilty, who was innocent. It was a pretty big deal. And so it's no surprise that Netflix has come back now for Series 2. They've gone back to explore this crime in this case. Not just because of the fact it was such a huge global phenomenon, but also because of the fact that the case is still ongoing. There has been ongoing legal action associated with this case. Before I get into that aspect of it, just some of the technical things about Season 2. For me, Season 2 is not quite as technically proficient, I don't think, as Season 1 was. It just doesn't feel quite as tight on the storytelling front. It feels like there is perhaps a bit too much padding. And possibly, I think there's too many episodes in this series. I think they probably could have chopped 2-3 episodes even and condensed this down, and they could have actually presented this information and told this story, I think, in a much more compelling kind of way. It just feels a little bit like at times the focus shifts from where it should be, which is on the evidence and the new case that's now being made in defense of these two men. And it shifts into other areas like the sort of the family drama. And often when it does that, it feels a lot more like sort of schmaltzy reality TV fakery. In the first series, it didn't really feel that way. It felt more sincere. It felt more genuine. There was more of a sort of rhythm of following this family through this particular scenario. But this time, it feels a lot like a lot of those family moments are very contrived for the sake of the cameras. They've been sort of put together in order to sort of have this stuff in a more formulaic way in Series 2. It doesn't feel quite as tight. It feels like there's a lot of padding. It feels like, so for example, I'm thinking of one particular scene now where they focus on the family, and they're with the family for about 4 or 5 minutes, trying to make a particular point, but you get to the end of it and you realize they didn't need to have a full 5 minutes of content there. What they could have done is they could have actually made that point in about 1.5 minutes, and they would have made that point a lot stronger. It would have been a lot clearer. And it just feels like oftentimes, just as you're getting into the interesting evidence, all of a sudden they sort of drop back into this more reality TV style approach to the family situation, and it's not really helping to focus on where the focus really should be, which is on the crime itself, on the evidence, and what the case that the lawyers are now trying to make in defense of these two men actually is. However, it's not all bad, and there are some new developments which come to the fore in Season 2, which I think are quite good, and I'll talk about some of those in just a minute. But before I do that, I want to talk about the crime itself and the sort of question of where does the guilt lie. When I got to the end of Season 1, I was pretty strong in my opinion. I felt that they hadn't done enough to convince that Steven Avery was innocent. A lot of what they were suggesting was very, very circumstantial and sort of conspiratorial. It relied on conspiracy. It relied on a lot of circumstance, the defense, I mean, that they were mounting to try and claim that he was innocent. However, I felt very strongly at the same time that Brendan Dassey was absolutely the victim of a miscarriage of justice. The way in which his confession was elicited, and you can watch that tape for yourself and you can see it, there's a real big problem there. Not just that, but there's no forensic evidence to back up that sort of key claim around what happened on the bed. That is all dependent on his confession and the way in which they elicited that confession from a 16-year-old male with a low IQ is, at best, you would say dubious, and that's at absolute best. And so I felt at the end of Season 1, Brendan Dassey was the victim of a miscarriage of justice. Steven Avery, however, I was still of the mind that I think, on the balance of probabilities, it still looks to me like he's actually guilty here. However, Season 2 has changed my thinking a little bit. I still feel strongly, in the same way that I did before about Brendan Dassey, I'm even more convinced now that he has been the victim of a miscarriage of justice around the way his confession was elicited and how he has been treated subsequently by the system. However, in regards to Steven Avery, I'm now not so certain about his guilt. And one of the reasons for that is this new lawyer who is trying to mount this appeal on his behalf, Kathleen Zellner. She is just phenomenal at actually doing her job. She's the kind of lawyer, after watching series 2, that you'd think to yourself, man, if I was ever wrongly accused of a crime, I'd be trying to look her up straight away and I would want her defending me. Because she really does open up new lines of inquiry that weren't presented, or were perhaps only briefly sort of alluded to or touched on in the first series. She really opens them up and follows certain investigatory sort of rabbit holes. And she has created, I think, some very serious reasonable doubt. Well, for me, certainly watching this, in my mind, there is some very serious reasonable doubt. Now, there is a big problem here, though, that I think it's really important to acknowledge. And that is the sort of the fundamental risk, if you like, that lies at the heart of any sort of true crime story like this, where you are trying to present the idea that you have an innocent person who has been wrongly convicted or wrongly charged with a crime that they didn't commit. And that is the fact that the whole drama and the whole reason that we want to keep watching this series is because it's really dependent upon this idea being true, that there has been a miscarriage of justice, that Steven Avery is actually innocent. So the show has a vested interest to keep that drama alive, and the way that that vested interest can play itself out if the filmmakers are not careful is they can lose objectivity and they can colour evidence or only present certain evidence that makes their client look innocent and actually ignore the rest. And in fact, what you can have happening here, and this is a real risk, particularly with season 2, because she's named 3 different people, and she's also made some pretty serious allegations around DNA tampering and planting and things like this. They're pretty serious if they're true, and she's named 3 possible alternative potential murderers here. Again, these are all very, very serious claims, but effectively she's conducted a sort of trial by media here. And I don't think that's a particularly healthy or good thing, because those people who have been accused, remember, they don't have the actual advantage of a proper, fairly overseen jury trial. They are just having their name sullied in this particular drama. And as I said, there's a potential vested interest here where they're only going to present evidence and facts that suit this whole idea that there's been a miscarriage of justice, because that's the very reason that you keep watching. If all of a sudden it looks pretty apparent that there is no miscarriage of justice, the drama pretty quickly disappears from the show, and unless you can find some new angle, there's no reason for anyone to keep watching. So there's a real risk in that, and I think it's worth keeping that in the front of your mind when you watch through season 2, when you analyze what you've been told in season 2. It is a danger, it is a flaw, and also the fact that, as I said, you've got a trial by media happening here, which is not a good thing at all. It is actually much better and a much more moral thing to do that you conduct a proper trial in the criminal justice system as much as you can. And this brings me to one of the positive developments that I was talking about earlier about season 2, and the fact that it really broadens the scope of the inquiry. It's not just about Brendan Dassey and Steven Avery and their particular cases, it's about the criminal justice system in America in general. You get to see a lot more of the workings of the criminal justice system beyond just these cases, and you realize the implications of what this all means. They explore, for example, a legislative change that was made to criminal justice under Bill Clinton's presidency back in the 90s, and how that change of legislation is impacting negatively upon their case now. And so it's really opening up these ideas around the criminal justice system and asking these big questions. Is American criminal justice actually broken? Are there some fundamental flaws here that need to be addressed? The other thing I think that's really fascinating about this season 2 is it's pretty clear here that this whole very simplistic approach to criminal justice and who benefits and who doesn't benefit from the justice system, this idea that it's all about white privilege, it really isn't a particularly helpful answer to this particular case and what we see going on here. You've got 2 white guys, 2 white males, in fact, who in theory should be benefiting from all that white privilege, but really clearly they're not at all. So what it suggests is this whole simplistic narrative around white privilege in the criminal justice system might not be as accurate as some people are trying to suggest. So overall for me, season 2, as I've said, even though it isn't as technically proficient as season 1, I don't think, for me, it has raised some pretty serious doubts about the guilt of Steven Avery. There's some pretty big questions that season 2 has raised, and it will be interesting to see where these go as this, this case progresses through the justice system. However, I think it's really important to remember that, a very, very important caveat, that we are witnessing a trial by media here. So any accusations, allegations that are made as a counter in defence of Stephen Avery, they must be weighed and tempered by that fact that this is trial by media, and it's in a situation where there is a vested interest to keep alive this idea that you have an innocent party who has been wrongly convicted. And so I think the safest and most appropriate and most moral way of addressing these issues is for them to actually go back into the criminal justice system for a proper, fair, open and transparent trial to take place where all of the facts can be put on the table. It seems to me that that would be the safest way of actually exploring these situations and trying to get to the bottom of them, if that is at all possible now with the amount of information that is flying around in the public about this particular crime. As per usual, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so please let me know what you think in the comment section below. And if you like the content I'm creating and you'd like to see more of it, then please support me on PayPal or Patreon. There is a link for both in the video description below. That's right, I can hear my theme music too. I'll see you tomorrow on The Daily Question.